These are three hard truths that every gardener needs to hear, because the fact is, as gardeners, we've all taken on some degree of responsibility for how we grow, how we utilize resources, and how we take care of the space that we've been given. I'm Taylor, and I help home gardeners explore sustainable and regenerative growing techniques that lead to abundance and fertility in our gardens while reducing waste. And the first hard truth that I want to talk about is actually intended to start us off on a hopeful but also a realistic foot. I can remember my grandma, who has since passed away, speak about soil as though it were something that you were stuck with. And this is an older way of thinking, but there are kind of some remnants in the way that we categorize soil as sandy, clay, or loamy. It sort of draws from a fixed perspective. Let's say that you move into a new house or you break ground on a new field and you find that the soil is really, really good and needs virtually no amendment. First of all, I would say the odds of that happening are incredibly low, especially if you're growing in a suburban or an urban environment where any sort of construction has happened. Likely, your soil is not going to be just ready to plant into, but let's say that it was. The only way that that would be the case realistically would either be if the soil had hardly been disturbed for decades, maybe longer, or if someone had put in a ton of work getting the soil to the good condition that it's in now. And this is a pretty accepted reality. Most of us know that soil is not something that you're stuck with. It can be improved. The hard truth is that it takes time to repair. And this grinds against the gears of kind of our instant fix culture. We've got a fixer-upper TV shows, right, that show a house going from rotting trash heap to magazine quality home in a matter of weeks. And there are a ton of things in our culture that condition us to have those expectations towards soil repair. But the reality is, at a bare minimum, I feel pretty confident saying that soil takes at least 1 year's worth of intentional remediation to be repaired, and then even then it'll take years more to get to an ideal state. A lot of the techniques that we teach on this channel are actually geared toward getting you results as quickly as possible. But the fact is, gardening is just a slow process all around. It's a huge multifaceted skill set. Soil health is not something we're really taught about in school growing up, at least I wasn't. And it's not always intuitive. And it certainly is not as intuitive as a lot of modern notions of soil repair would lead you to believe. Probably the most obvious sign of our instant gratification culture encroaching on the nuanced topic of soil health is the repeated usage of mechanical tillage. Tilling the soil is an act of impatience. And I don't say this as a one-size-fits-all statement. Oftentimes tillage is required to start out a previously compacted growing space. I've used it, I probably will use it again. But hitting the reset button on your soil year after year after year so that you can easily just bury the weeds and break up the clumps of earth matter is not going to lead to long-term soil health. It's a quick fix that needs to be followed up on with long-term building techniques. Something that modern soil science has just barely recently begun to appreciate is the biological component of healthy soil. Conventional wisdom is pretty adamant that soil health is all about chemistry. And that's why we're sold chemicals in the store. Synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. The goal of a lot of conventional approaches is to manually balance out the chemicals in your growing space. But what we've just started to realize really over the past few decades is the undeniable role and importance of microorganisms as far as creating healthy soil. And truthfully, from my perspective, microbes are the most promising path forward to amending soil that I see. One of the main objectives of this channel is to highlight the various options that you have when it comes to nurturing the microbial conditions of your growing space. And I really appreciate the mantra that Jesse Frost uses in his book, The Living Soil Handbook, where he says, disturb the soil as little as possible, keep the soil covered as much as possible, and keep the soil planted as much as possible. And I really appreciate those words, as much as possible, because there's a grace that we need to extend to ourselves whenever we're doing something so broad as caring for the earth. There's really no reality where we're just gonna achieve a perfect practice overnight, but it gives us a good framework for where to start. And so to break these down a little bit further, I'll say that disturbing the soil as little as possible means avoiding repeated mechanical tillage. It also means avoiding driving heavy equipment and limiting foot traffic in growing spaces. Something that still surprises me is when I see someone stepping directly onto soil that is clearly being used to grow plants. I've had people step directly onto my garden beds without a care. And I think that this is actually a learned skill to avoid stepping on plants and garden soil, because we've taught our children to find the pathway. I've literally seen our typically uncontrollable 2-year-old now 3-year-old, run at breakneck speed toward one of our garden beds and stop herself just before stepping on the soil, stepping to the side, and course correcting onto the wood chip path. I'm getting a little bit off topic. Disturb the soil as little as possible. Keep the soil covered as much as possible. This just means use a mulch. Try to limit the amount of spaces in your garden where the soil is left bare. And this can mean spreading an organic mulch as a carbon-rich material, or leaves or straw. This can also mean planting a bit more densely. In my experience, spacing guidelines are pretty arbitrary and seem to encourage wide open spaces in a planted garden bed, which brings us to keep the soil planted as much as possible. And the reason this results in soil remediation is because when the plants send their roots into the soil to look for nutrients, they're actually looking for microbes that they can exchange nutrients with. Microorganisms in the soil are responsible for processing and delivering plant available nutrients, while plants provide them with root exudates, which come in the form of sugary liquids that provide the microbes with energy. Pretty much anywhere that a plant is growing, that exchange is occurring. But even by following these 3 tenets, it takes probably more time than you'd prefer to see change in your soil conditions. And that said, a few things that you can do to speed the process along involve saturating your undisturbed, covered, planted soil with beneficial microbes. And I'm always going to be an advocate for homemade solid form and liquid microbial inoculants. Dr. Elaine Ingham has really popularized the aerated compost and worm casting teas that are designed to rapidly multiply microbes found in your compost and then spray them out onto plants and on the soil as a way to spread them far and wide. And these are just made by putting compost or worm castings in a paint strainer, steeping that in a bucket of water, feeding it some extra nutrients, and using a bubbler to aerate the tea for a few days. But if you don't have a bubbler yet, you can make an even simpler and potentially even more effective microbial tea by using some leaf mold soil in place of compost or worm castings, and then feeding in a carbohydrate source like mashed potato or blended mixed grains and sea salt. This is something out of the Jadam Organic Farming Playbook, which is a subset of Korean natural farming. And it's a really fast and easy way to get the microbes in your soil going. We make this stuff pretty much year round and have been really impressed with what it's capable of in terms of breaking up soil compaction and providing plants with microbes to exchange for that nutrient exchange. You can check out our video on how to make that if you want to go a bit more in depth, or you can download our free homemade microbial solution recipe PDF linked in the description. So to recap, soil quality absolutely can be improved, but the hard truth is that it takes time. And that's not something that we're always comfortable with. This channel is all about exploring solutions for problems that we face as growers. And if you would like to get weekly gardening insights that help you do that, the best way is to sign up for my email newsletter. I provide ideas, tips, and tricks, introduce you to hopefully new gardening techniques each week, and give direction for tangible steps that you can take. And as we continue into our next hard truth, we're gonna get a little bit more uncomfortable because we're venturing into territory that involves our daily lives and personal responsibility. So the second hard truth that I want to discuss is that our current system of importing soil and exporting waste is unsustainable at a level so unprecedented, it's hard to wrap my mind around. In the United States alone, an estimated 60 million tons, that's 120 billion pounds of food waste is generated, and largely ends up in landfills every year. An estimated 90 million tons of municipal yard waste is generated each year, which largely ends up in the landfills. So that's a combined 150 million tons, or 300 billion pounds of waste, all coming from homes. In the meantime, we can estimate that the US home gardening sector likely brings in several tens of millions of tons of soil from off-site sources each year. And it's hard to get exact estimates here. I'll link in the description some of the sources that I used to figure out this data. But even if a small amount of this is true, the hard truth is that we're stuck in a pretty harmful cycle of importing soil to our home gardens and exporting what could be used to turn into soil to the landfill. And in case you didn't know, landfills are not giant compost heaps. They're more like toxic waste sites that stop decomposition from occurring. The way that waste is compressed and mixed and pressed into the earth, it doesn't allow for the kind of delicate conditions required for real decomposition. This is far from a novel insight, and I was going to say that I'm not really trying to make anyone feel guilty about this, but honestly, we probably should feel a little bit guilty about it. I feel it, and it's not like a wallowing in self-hate guilt that leads to nothing. We actually need to let that guilt just turn into ownership. Now, our governments are going to make vast sweeping plans that may or may not make a dent in this problem. Either way, I don't really think that we can afford to wait and see if those are going to work. Instead, I'm really pretty interested in the many techniques that are currently available for home gardeners to actually keep their waste products and generate their own soil. One of which is a solution to food waste that we just covered in our last video using a simple ingredient, lactic acid bacteria, which you can culture at home. Within 1 week, you can prepare your food waste, meat, dairy, and uncooked foods included, into nutrient-rich compost or just high-quality garden soil. Rather than tossing weeds into the yard waste bin, you could toss them into a bucket, add some leaf mold, soil, and water, and brew your very own liquid fertilizer. Then once those weeds have decomposed a bit and drowned the seeds, you could compost them along with your fallen leaves and lawn clippings. If you've got sticks and logs, rather than shipping those away, you could use them to build hugelkultur garden beds or make biochar out of them. The point that I'm trying to make here is that with a little bit of intentionality, we actually can stop thinking of things as strictly waste products and start taking responsibility to process them into soil. Yeah, it takes a little additional effort and a few steps, but that waste has to go somewhere. And if you're buying in compost and potting mix every year, why not make a bit of that yourself with what you have on hand? It's more than likely you're not using your waste to its fullest potential. None of us probably are. Now, this is a hard mindset to change because it's pretty baked into the systems that we've inherited. It's very normal in this day and age to generate waste as humans and to then to send it somewhere for someone else to deal with. I don't claim to be above this, by the way. This is totally something that I'm working on to improve for our lives, but making this simple shift of asking the question, what could I do with this other than throw it away, is a pretty simple task that most of us can at least try. And for our last hard truth though, I want to address something that is potentially one of the most challenging to accept because it's so thoroughly baked into the culture, at least here in America. And it has to do with the way that we think about and use our space. And again, I want to make this clear that I am a part of this problem as much as anyone else. I'm not saying this because I know that I'm right or that I've figured it all out here. But the hard truth that I want to share here is that as people, and especially as home gardeners, we really need to start recognizing the harm that lawns are doing. And this is strangely one of the most sensitive topics that I've encountered when it comes to talking with homeowners especially. And there are a lot of reasons for that, I think. But one of the main reasons is because of actually why we have lawns in the first place. There's a really fascinating history. And by fascinating, I mean mildly disturbing history when it comes to how we got to the point where the home lawn was normalized. Lawns have a long history stretching back to the 12th century or maybe even earlier. For centuries, these grass patches were largely considered food for livestock. Goats, sheep, cows, and other ruminants were the lawnmower. But I think that most of the lawns that we would see if we could go back in time would not resemble what we see today. It wouldn't be until the 17th and 18th centuries that European manor houses began flaunting their wealth and expressing their dominance over nature by maintaining enormous green expanses throughout their properties. Since there weren't sprinkler systems in the way that we have them now, at least, possessing a lawn was a sign that you had extreme wealth because it meant that you could employ servants to hand water and cut your grass. Grass that no longer was being used as food strictly for animals, it was just grown for aesthetic appeal. And I'm painting with broad strokes here and skipping through many historical events, but over the course of several centuries, lawns gained a considerable amount of popularity amongst the Western cultural elite. And as the suburbs were being pioneered in the mid-1800s, various individuals began propagating a vision for the American landscape that largely involved installing grass patches in the front and behind newly built homes. There was a dude named Frank J. Scott who published a book called The Art of Beautifying Suburban Home Grounds. And in this book, he really pushed this idea that a genuine expression of democracy in America meant giving the average citizen the opportunity to taste what only the elite could previously afford. And with the invention of the push mower, this became possible for many Americans. So while there is some functionality to a lawn, it provides a comfortable space to stand barefoot outdoors, it keeps dirt and mud somewhat subdued, and it sort of looks nice. At its core, it's a way that at least American suburbanites can express their status. Ironically, at least in my opinion, lawns go against another American value, which is individualism. Lawns are kind of the definition of conformity. And perhaps you've felt that pressure to maintain appearances for the sake of staying friends with your neighbors, or maybe you haven't. You haven't felt any pressure and you've just got a lawn because you haven't thought about it until right now. But just understanding the origins of the democratized lawn doesn't really cause ongoing concern, which might lead you to ask, are lawns really that bad? So to answer that, I want to point out the 4 things that define a perfect lawn, and then we'll look at what it takes to achieve those. Generally speaking, a perfect lawn, from what I can tell, is one that is free of pests, free of weeds, cut to a short height, maybe between 2 to 3 inches, and is consistently green. And so to achieve that, we're going to need a way to keep pests away, weeds out, regular cutting, and continuous watering, at least in warm weather. So let's get specific, starting with water needs. It's estimated that 9 billion gallons of water are used to maintain lawns in the US every day. That's over 10,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools being filled and emptied out every day. That's 3 trillion gallons of water a year so that we can have green grass for people to admire. When it comes to cutting, gas-powered lawnmowers and weed whackers are polluting the air, and that short grass is actually part of the reason that it takes so much water to keep it green. The sun evaporates moisture really fast when there's little blocking its rays. Short grass also greatly limits the bugs and insects by virtually removing their habitat. And even if lawns were growing longer, native pollinators and other beneficial wildlife don't really get much out of grass because most of it is non-native and it doesn't serve as a legitimate source of food for them. As far as other ways to get rid of pests and weeds, we need to dip briefly back into some history, specifically the First and Second World Wars. And this is pretty sketchy, in my opinion. After the First World War, the American Chemical Warfare Service was facing irrelevance, but they still had tons of toxic chemicals on hand. So they conveniently rebranded themselves from the Chemical Warfare Service to the Chemical Peace Service. And they began marketing their chemicals, in part to homeowners who would use them to control pests and disease. DDT was a commonly used chemical that was great for protecting soldiers from disease-carrying insects overseas, but when the Second World War ended, again, the Chemical Corps started selling it to civilians for garden and lawn care purposes. Now, DDT was quickly discovered to be responsible for driving various birds into extinction and causing cancer in humans, so we stopped using it. But many other toxic chemicals are used to this day to keep weeds down and pest control, all of which, in my opinion, are harmful to everyone involved, but most notoriously being glyphosate, or as you might know it, Roundup. So let's recap a little bit. We've got this staple of American life, the suburban lawn, that covers nearly 40 million acres of land, making it the single largest irrigated crop in the country. Except that it's not a crop in most cases, unless you're letting your backyard chickens graze on it. Not only that, but it's providing no legitimate habitat for native wildlife. It consumes an estimated 9 billion gallons of water a day to keep green, and it needs to be meticulously maintained by cutting it once or twice a week with machines that pollute the air, and by eradicating any potential for biodiversity by engaging in chemical warfare. It's fascinating, really, the obsession with control when it comes to lawns. Weeds are widely considered a sign of damaged soil. The earth utilizes weeds as a self-defense mechanism. Oftentimes, weeds will sprout in compact and nutrient-depleted soils, and as a way to break up compaction and remineralize the soil. And obviously, I don't mean that the earth is sentient and deploys weeds to recover soil health. Weeds are a part of an infinitely complex set of symbiotic processes that have developed over billions of years to protect the soil, from which pretty much all life originates. So as frustrating as weeds can be, it's troubling that our gut instinct to a weed's appearance is not to ask why it's there, but instead to ask, how can I get this thing out of my sight as quickly as possible? It's worth asking, why is the soil trying to repair or even defend itself? And it's worth acknowledging at some level the abuse that's being done to the planet. Now, I'm coming down hard on this topic, and again, I realize that it's a sensitive one for many of us, myself included. In a sense, it's inescapable because it's such a deeply ingrained expectation of society that we have perfect lawns. But there are legitimate solutions, and one that I want to emphasize is that at some level, whereas in recent history, turf grass has been celebrated, I think it's actually well past time to move the needle in the opposite direction. And since visual cultural expectations are what got us in this mess in the first place, we kind of need a grassroots movement, pardon the expression, to take hold and begin to reclaim a more ecologically sustainable approach to modern suburban landscape. I don't expect this video to be the sole catalyst for that change, or even really a substantial one. This is just something that's near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to talk about. But I want to offer a few suggestions for those of you who might be wondering on how we might move toward that ecologically sustainable approach to our yards. And the first one is pretty basic, but I think that the function of a lawn being a place that you can stand on comfortably without getting your shoes or bare feet too dirty can be achieved by replacing your lawn with, or even incorporating into your lawn, different ground cover plants. Clover is a classic choice that helps fix nitrogen in the soil. It supports pollinators and it stands up to foot traffic. Creeping thyme is a great perennial that provides flowers and forms a mat that can be walked on occasionally. Also smells great. Native prairie grasses can be incorporated to add texture and provide habitats while naturally integrating with turf. I've seen pretty decent looking yarrow lawns as well. Basically, they're options if you'd really like to retain the look and the feel of your grass patch. Another relatively easy addition that as home gardeners you're probably already doing is growing pollinator islands that provide food sources for the native insects in your area and break up the terrain a little bit. If you're not doing this yet, you might consider native flowers and beneficial plants that you could incorporate into your landscape and even break up the lawn space a bit. On a more expansive scale, something that has become increasingly popular, at least in my area, is replacing lawn with wood chips. And the basic way to do this is to cover grass with a tarp long enough to kill it, which might take a few years, or maybe better yet, to cover it with cardboard and place wood chips directly on the top to keep it weighed down. Wood chips help the soil to retain moisture, and they break down slowly, feeding beneficial fungi in the soil, making it great for establishing a drought-tolerant perennial garden. In the major city that we live near, Spokane, Washington, we've observed more and more homeowners making this shift to actually ditching their lawns and spreading cardboard and wood chips over the top. And one of the reasons that this is the case is actually because the city of Spokane started offering a rebate to residential water customers to replace their lawns with water-conserving landscape. And I'd say that over the past few years, I've seen a significant shift in the number of homes that contain a turf grass-covered yard to a wood-chipped yard. And you can tell me which you think looks better. Now, obviously, this is a lot of work, both physically and psychologically, so I don't mean to send this message out to you so that you can feel ashamed if you have a lawn. Lawns are the expectation for suburbanites right now in the US. I'm just doing a really small part in ringing the alarm bell a little bit that we kind of need to make a shift and start adopting some better practices. And maybe one of the things that we need to allow ourselves to do is to adopt a slightly messier standard of yard appearance. Nature is not straight lines and spiffy clean. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I'm not saying that aesthetics don't matter at all, but that perfectly manicured, looks like no one lives here look is a pretty high bar to reach, considering many of the natural processes at play are working against you. All right, I am gonna wrap things up there. Hopefully we are still friends. I say none of these truths from a pedestal speaking downward. I actually am speaking firstly to myself because I know that I am a part of these unsustainable practices and perspectives as much as anyone else. If you made it to the end, I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for joining me on the journey to normalize regenerative practices, even at the home garden and small scale farming level. If you know someone who needs to hear any of these hard truths, if you're looking to start a fight with a family member in anticipation of a lively Thanksgiving dinner discussion, please share this video with them. If you enjoyed this video and you want to take a step toward reducing your waste, you can check out this video next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.